Happy Sunday. William Butler Yeats, who has always had a hold on my imagination, once said, "You that would judge me, do not judge alone this book or that. Come to this hallowed place where my friends' portraits hang, and look thereon. Think where man's glory most begins and ends, and say that my glory was I had such friends." In getting to know our Savior better, I suggested last week that we get to know his friends, because you can often judge someone by the company they keep. We talked about Christ's best friend last week, Judas, the betrayer who marked Jesus for death with a kiss, but who also might have better known Christ's real message than any of the other disciples. At least that's what it said in the Gospel of Judas, if you remember, that Judas knew this was about the kingdom within and really understood the message. So this week, let's look at Jesus's closest disciple while we're talking about the disciples, his closest follower, the chief of the original apostles, the rock on whom the church prior to the restoration was founded, the apostle Peter, Saint Peter. Where Judas lacked an origin story, he just sort of appears at Jesus's side, Peter has a well-defined and recounted story of first meeting Jesus. When they first meet, Peter is a fisherman, I believe in Bethsaida, going by the name of Simon. By biblical accounts, Peter has a wife and even introduces Jesus to his family. Most specifically, Peter introduces Jesus to his mother for a healing in Capernaum. I think that's a good place to begin in showing already some distinctions between Peter and Judas, because Judas was just Judas. There's no indication of a name change. He didn't convert over to the Jesus camp that we see. He was just a pal of Jesus with no other clear relationships, wives and mothers and family and a homeland, or ties to anything outside of the Christian movement. That was Judas. Peter, though, we see rooted in his homeland, rooted in the Jewish people, rooted with his wife, his mother, his family, a person in this place and time. He had a full life. He had a job. Maybe most important to Jesus's immediate needs, Peter had a boat. When you hear stories of Jesus preaching to the multitudes from a boat, it was Peter's boat. Peter wasn't necessarily a close friend, maybe. He was an ardent supporter and a contributor to the cause. So this is a very different relationship from the one we saw with Judas. Now, how did Peter get caught up in this movement then? If he's not one of Jesus's buddies who kind of just falls in with him, how did he get into this movement? The description in the Synoptic Gospels is a bit short. Jesus, near the beginning of his ministry, finds two brothers, Andrew and Peter, fishing using a net. And Christ calls out to them, "Come, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." And so they follow him. The Gospel of John then fills in the story a bit more. It explains that the Apostle Andrew witnessed Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist, and then went and told his brother Peter that he had found the Messiah. That's when Peter was brought back to meet Jesus. Both accounts mesh well if you kind of take the fish haul to be more of an allegory. I mean, it's already right next to it, but I'm purely speculating. But, why would Andrew have been at the baptism of Jesus? There wouldn't have been a way for Andrew to know this was going to be a special baptism, as Jesus' big debut on the world stage is this baptism. Nobody really knows who he is until this moment when the clouds open up and there's this giant celestial event. So Andrew, one has to assume Andrew wasn't there to see Jesus. He wasn't already planning to see this. he was just one of John the Baptist's followers. He was already in John the Baptist's movement. And so he was showing up to these baptism revivals regularly. I kind of picture like those old-timey revivals, but that's probably just my 1800s American Christian brain working. And since Andrew runs right back to Peter after he sees the celestial event in this baptism to tell Peter what he's witnessed and that he's found the Messiah, I think it can be pretty easily argued that Peter was fairly involved in this movement to some extent too. So here are Andrew and Peter possibly fishing for true believers with John the Baptist, part of these movements, and coming up short. And then Jesus tells them he will teach them how to cast their nets in a better way to catch a different haul. So it's just a thought, and we're going to run with it because I think it paints a better picture of Peter. Again, contrasting him with Judas. Judas was a friend of Jesus, but Peter was a man on a mission to find the Messiah and to bring people to messianic salvation. Until Peter met Jesus, he wasn't having much luck catching converts, maybe. But Jesus changed that for him and his brother. That's not to say that, like, all this isn't to say that Peter was distant from Jesus. I'm not trying and kind of saying maybe he wasn't a close friend and that sort of stuff. I'm just juxtaposing him to Judas. Obviously, Peter was a very close disciple. And after Judas, he's the most discussed apostle in the Gospels. We know that Jesus preached from Peter's boat. And when Jesus walked on water, when he got out of that boat and walked on water, it was Peter Jesus called out to him. And then Peter even steps out onto the waves and manages the miracle too for a moment before his faith wavers and he sinks. Peter had that problem with his faith wavering. At the Last Supper, Jesus offers to wash all the disciples' feet, and Peter turns him down initially. While an argument could be made that this shows a lack of faith on Peter's part in himself, it also shows that Peter didn't follow blindly or have perfect faith, that he was a servant worthy of being on the path of Christ. Peter also had violence in his heart. When Jesus is arrested, Peter cuts off one of the arresting officer's ears. Jumping back just a little in our conversation here, I wonder if violent revolution was already on Peter's mind long before he met Jesus. If Peter's a follower of John the Baptist and someone familiar in the messianic movements of the time, I think an argument could be made that he was likely prepared for the Messiah we hear about, that Jewish Messiah that would lead his people in violent revolt against the Roman occupation. Peter might have already been very active in preparing for a violent ousting of the Romans by a religious faction. Jesus, of course, rebukes Peter for his action when he cuts off that officer's ear, and then Jesus heals it. After, when Jesus is dead, Peter denies Christ, right, the 3 times, and the Christian movement initially. Peter claims no part of the movement 3 times that night. Usually, at least when I see it, I feel like that's painted as like Peter feared reprisal. He was afraid the mob would turn on him and he'd get crucified too or something. But it doesn't ring right to me. And just giving this kind of picture of maybe who Peter was before he met Jesus. And now we've gone through him meeting Jesus, and then Jesus is dead. And here's Peter, a violent revolutionary who's already active in rebellious circles. Would he suddenly have cold feet because he was sad about Jesus' death and afraid that people would hurt him? What if, just a what if, Peter was a little scared after the fact that he had backed the wrong horse Look at the narrative I just laid out in these last few minutes. Here's this young Middle Eastern revolutionary, active in Semitic religious movements who are often violently opposed to European occupation of Judea. Peter's not only ready and willing to take up the sword against the European occupiers and their compatriots among his own people, he actively does take up that sword against the occupiers and their compatriots among his own people when Christ is arrested. So there's every reason to think that Peter believed in that old style Jewish Messiah, the conquering kind, the kind that would toss the Europeans occupying Judea out, not with words, but with strength, physical strength. Then Jesus shows up, preaches allegories about the kingdom within, and is openly murdered by the occupying European forces and their sympathetic religious forces among the native peoples of Israel. I could imagine if I was that disciple who had been trying to back off from violent revolution to follow this new, more peaceful leader, and then only to see him murdered by the very people I wanted tossed out of my homeland, I'd have a few hours of dark rejection and denial of him too. After the crucifixion, Peter does eventually regain his composure. But I can absolutely see in those few hours that denial being something much more than simply saying, oh, I didn't know him. What if Peter was really saying, oh, I don't know if I'm choosing to follow him because I want to fight back. So maybe Peter's conversion starts a little later than that fishing story. After the crucifixion, Peter's arrested a few times. He defies the authorities who are complicit in the European occupation of his country. But like our modern Malcolm X, if you're a little familiar with the story of Malcolm X, Peter takes a missionary journey through Roman-occupied lands. And he begins to see that Christ's message isn't just for the Middle Eastern people, but for the Europeans too. Peter then begins to adapt his faith and the way he teaches it and repeal some of the older Jewish laws around dietary restrictions still present in that very early Christianity. And then Peter begins to actively even evangelize to those Europeans. And eventually he comes to say, God shows no partiality. Peter continues his travels and leaves Jerusalem, so he goes even further on his mission. And according to tradition, he's eventually crucified himself in Europe for trying to preach to the European peoples. So I always try to give more than just a little biographical details or things you can easily look up yourself in my messages here. And I hope I've done that so far just by kind of painting this picture of Peter, kind of trying to make him a little more three-dimensional. I'm obviously speculating, but this is in the text. I'm not really going too far off because I think it's easy to miss connecting these dots on Peter. This wasn't just a simple country fisherman hanging out, casting his line in the creek one day who suddenly decides to follow Jesus. That's really in the Gospels. It's not him. That's not him. He's not just this fisherman sitting there and then Jesus comes along and he says, oh, I'll go with him. This was a revolutionary already active in Messianic circles. We don't get it in the beginning, but by the end, we know this was a violent man fighting the European occupation of Israel. Peter's conversion, I'd almost argue, seems to come after Christ's atonement, because that's when Peter is faced with a difficult choice. Deny Christ, deny the Christian, the Jesus movement, and return to the revolutionary ways of fighting the Romans, or accept Christ and work to convert the European invaders to the faith through preaching and cooperative efforts. We know Peter chose the latter because Peter is called the Rock. The pre-Restoration church was founded on Peter, and that speaks volumes as to the weight of Peter's choice. Christianity could have been another violent revolutionary movement championed by the memory of a martyr. Peter could have been the person who did that championing. But because Peter chose to hear Christ's message and try to work with those who weren't like him instead of violently oppose them through terrorist actions, Peter was able to birth the world's most widely practiced religion. I don't think I have Peter's strength. It's hard to work with people who, native or not, feel like an invading force in my own country. Native or not. It's hard to see those people's war crimes and their incursion into the very fabric of my homeland, into the religious leaders of my homeland, and not want to violently fight back against those people, to just burn it down. But Peter chose a different way. Maybe we can too. God bless and have a good week.